There's a moment, and I think most people who have lived through something extraordinary will know exactly what I mean, where you look back and realize you had no idea what you were standing next to. No idea at all. I've been trying to write this down for about 3 years now. Every time I start, I get maybe 4 paragraphs in and then I stop because I don't know how to explain it in a way that doesn't sound insane. But I figure enough time has passed. Enough of it has become public record. And honestly, I think the world deserves to know what actually happened, not the sanitized version they released through the Galactic Transit Authority's press office, but the real version. The version where I'm just a 26-year-old graduate student who brought a lonely alien girl a cup of bad cafeteria coffee and accidentally started something that changed the political architecture of 4-star systems. So here we go. My name is Marcus Webb. At the time of everything I'm about to describe, I was finishing my master's thesis in xenolinguistics at the Meridian Institute of Advanced Studies, which sounds impressive until you understand that the Meridian Institute was, and continues to be, the most underfunded research university in the Northern Territorial Compact. We had 3 functioning elevators in a 12-story building. The xenolinguistics department shared a floor with the recycling logistics office, and there was always the faint smell of compressed aluminum in our seminar rooms. We had one authentic alien-built translation interface, a second-hand Valorian model that was so old it still used the pre-unification symbol set, and our department chair, Professor Nadia Holloway, had to fill out a 14-form requisition request every time we wanted to use it for more than 2 hours. That's the world I was living in. It was late autumn, the kind of gray, damp autumn that settles over northern compact cities like a wet blanket and refuses to leave until March. The campus had that particular end-of-semester energy, half exhaustion, half desperation, where everyone was either buried in library stacks or sitting in the student lounge staring at the wall with the expression of someone who has recently made very poor life choices. I was in the student lounge. I was absolutely one of the wall starers. My thesis advisor had just told me very kindly but very firmly that my entire 3rd chapter needed to be restructured because I'd based a core argument on a translation of Cathari phonological patterns that apparently reflected a regional dialect variant and not the standardized form I'd claimed it was. 6 months of work. Just restructured. Not thrown out, she was careful to say that. Just restructured. I had bought myself a coffee from the machine in the corner, the machine that charged $2.50 for what tasted strongly of disappointment. And I was sitting in the far corner of the lounge trying to will myself into a state of productive motivation and failing completely. That's when I noticed her. She was sitting at a table on the opposite side of the lounge, near the window that looked out over the gray courtyard where a single automated maintenance drone was slowly cleaning leaves off the walkway. She had a stack of physical textbooks in front of her, actual paper books, which was unusual enough to notice, and she was reading one of them with an intensity that I recognized. It's the intensity of someone who is working very, very hard to understand something, and is not quite getting there, and is starting to feel the specific quiet panic of academic inadequacy. I recognized it because I had been experiencing it myself for about 6 months. She was Sethani. I could tell that from the bioluminescent tracery along her temples and the slight silver cast to her skin. Sethani are one of the older species in the Galactic Transit Network, one of the first 3 to make formal contact with Earth, and they've been sending students to human universities for about 40 years now. So they're not uncommon on campuses. I'd had 3 Sethani classmates in my undergraduate years and 1 in my master's program. But there was something different about this one, and it took me a while to figure out what it was. She was alone, completely alone. Not in the way that people are alone because they prefer solitude. I'm like that sometimes. I can sit in a full library and feel perfectly content in my own head. She was alone in the way that people are alone when they would rather not be. There was a careful, controlled stillness about her that I'd seen before, in myself, honestly, in my first year of graduate school when I hadn't yet figured out how to make friends in an academic environment, and was pretending that I didn't care about that. The tracery along her temples was dim. I didn't know enough about Sethani biology at that point to read that as anything specific, but I know now that in Sethani emotional physiology, dimming bioluminescence is roughly analogous to what humans do when they're sad. Not crying sad, the quieter kind, the kind you carry around all day without talking about it. I don't know exactly what made me stand up. Honestly, I think it was partly that I needed to do something, anything, that wasn't thinking about my thesis. But I also genuinely hate seeing people sit alone and look like they're having a bad time. It's just a thing about me. My mother used to say I had the social instincts of a golden retriever, and she didn't mean it as a compliment, but I've made peace with it. I walked over to the coffee machine. I got 2 cups. Then I walked over to her table. "Hey," I said, very eloquent. "Are you okay? You look like you might be having the same kind of day I'm having, which is not great." She looked up from her book, and this is the part that I always find hard to describe to people who weren't there because her eyes were extraordinary. Not in a way I'd been warned about or prepared for. Sethani eyes are silver gray with this deep structural luminescence that shifts with light angle, and I'd seen Sethani before, but this woman's eyes had something else in them. A weight, like she'd been carrying something for a very long time. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that I can only describe as carefully calibrated neutrality, like she was deciding something. "I am," she said, "attempting to understand the socio-economic implications of the boundary collapse of 2187 as interpreted through a human historiographical framework." A pause. The textbook is not well written. I looked at the book. Frontier Economics and the Post-Boundary Economic Reorganization, 3rd edition, Professor Alistair Green. I happen to know that book because it was on our optional reading list for a seminar I'd taken the previous year. "Oh, that book is terrible," I said, and I said it with genuine feeling because it was. The 3rd chapter alone should be a war crime. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile. Sethani facial musculature is different from human, and their expressions don't map directly, but something in the direction of amusement. "Please sit," she said. I sat. I put the second coffee in front of her. She looked at it with the particular expression of someone who has encountered something unfamiliar and is deciding how to respond. "It's coffee," I said. "It's bad, but it's warm." "I have had coffee before," she said. "At the welcoming reception, it was also bad." That's basically the full coffee experience at Meridian Institute. She picked it up. She held it with both hands the way you hold something when you want the warmth from it, and that small gesture, so completely, recognizably human in its instinct, made me feel something I didn't quite have words for yet. "My name is Marcus," I said. "Sarin," she said. Just that, just the one name, which again I noted but didn't think much about. Sethani often go by single names in non-formal contexts. It's a cultural thing, or so I assumed. We talked for 2 hours. That first conversation was, it's hard to summarize it without making it sound either more significant than it felt in the moment or less significant than it actually was. Both of those things would be dishonest. She was studying galactic economic history. She was enrolled in the graduate program in political economy, which was 2 floors up from xenolinguistics, and she'd been at Meridian for about 8 weeks. We talked about the boundary collapse. I knew more about it than she might have expected because the linguistic transformations that followed the compact reorganization are kind of a big deal in my field, and she talked about the textbook with a dry, precise frustration that I found unexpectedly funny. She had a way of identifying exactly what was wrong with an argument and stating it in the fewest possible words. No decoration, no hedging, just, this premise is incorrect, and here's why. I found out later that this is a specific communication style of the Sethani upper academic class, but at the time I just thought she was very smart and very direct, which are 2 qualities I tend to enjoy in people. What I noticed over the course of those 2 hours was that she kept checking herself, like she'd start to say something and then pull it back slightly, reframe it, make it smaller. I assumed this was a language thing. She spoke standard perfectly, with a slight formal cadence that marked her as having learned it academically rather than conversationally, but her vocabulary was excellent and her comprehension was clearly strong. It didn't read like a language limitation. It read like something else. When I finally got up to leave, I had a session booked on the translation interface at 7, and if you were more than 5 minutes late, they gave your slot to the waiting list. She said something that has stayed with me. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting down. Not thank you for the coffee or thank you for the conversation. Just thank you for sitting down, for making the choice to cross the room." I said something like "any time" or "see you around" and went to my interface session. On the way up in the elevator, one of the functioning ones, I found myself thinking about the weight in her eyes. and the dimness of her bioluminescence, and the way she'd held the coffee cup like she wanted the warmth. I didn't think she was the supreme commander of the Sethani Imperial Fleet. I want to be very clear about that. At no point in that elevator ride did that possibility cross my mind. I just thought, I hope she's okay. I hope she has people. I didn't know yet that she was the one person in the galaxy who most certainly did not. The second time I ran into Saren was 4 days later, in the East Library. I was in the periodicals section, which in our library was a slightly depressing room with flickering overhead lights and chairs that had been ergonomically designed for some species other than human. Because every time I sat in one, I ended up with my spine at an angle that my physical therapist would describe as aggressively incorrect. But the periodicals room had the full back catalog of the Galactic Linguistics Quarterly, which I needed, so I spent a lot of time in ergonomically incorrect chairs reading about phonological drift patterns in species that didn't have mouths. Saren was at one of the reading terminals. She had a data tablet in front of her, her own, not an institute one, which was notable because it was very clearly not a human-manufactured device. The casing was some kind of material I didn't recognize, matte and very slightly warm-looking, and it had an interface that was organized in a way that didn't look like any software I'd seen. She hadn't noticed me come in. She was reading something on the terminal with that same focused intensity, but this time there was something different in her posture, tighter, like the information on the screen was not distressing exactly, more like it required a response she wasn't able to give right now. I hesitated in the doorway for a second. I didn't want to intrude. But she looked up before I could decide, and the carefully calibrated neutrality was back in place so fast I almost missed what had been there before. "Marcus," she said. "Hey, sorry I'm not interrupting." "You are not." She gestured at the chair next to her in a way that suggested this was not an invitation so much as a statement of permission. I sat. "How's the terrible economics textbook?" A small pause. "I have completed it." The conclusion was consistent with the preceding chapters in quality. "Devastating." "I have begun the secondary reading list. It is marginally better." We fell into a conversation the way you do with someone you've already talked to once and liked, easily, without the awkward calibration of a first meeting. She asked about my thesis. I gave her the abbreviated version of the great dialect disaster, and she listened with complete attention, which is rarer than it should be. And when I finished, she said, "The error is frustrating, but the correction will make the work stronger. A foundation that has been tested is more reliable than one that has not." It was such a simple thing to say, but it landed differently than when people say things like, "At least you found out now," or "Just think of it as a learning experience," which are the kinds of comfort that feel like they were manufactured by a well-intentioned algorithm. What she said felt like something she actually believed. We talked for about an hour. At some point she asked me whether I found it strange studying languages. "Languages that are not your own," she clarified, "learning how other species structure thought." I said I found it the opposite of strange. I said it was the most interesting thing I could imagine doing, because the way a species builds its language is the clearest window into how they understand the universe. Grammar is philosophy. Vocabulary is priority. The sounds a species chooses to make meaning with tell you something about what meaning matters to them. She was quiet for a moment after that. "That is," she said, and then stopped, started again. "I have not heard it described in that way before, but it is accurate." I asked whether she spoke many languages. She said she spoke several. She said it the way someone says something that is technically true, but is also, in some important way, an understatement. I had no idea. Before I left, I mentioned that a group of graduate students from 3 or 4 departments did a weekly informal dinner at a place called Orin's, about 10 minutes from campus. Nothing organized, just people who'd been in the same buildings for long enough that they'd gravitated together. I said she was welcome to come if she wanted. She said she would consider it. She came the following Thursday. Orin's was, it's important to understand what Orin's was, because it's the backdrop for a lot of what happened over the next several months. Orin's was a restaurant that had started as a human place. Then gradually, as the alien student population at Meridian grew, had adapted its menu and its atmosphere to accommodate a much wider range of dietary needs and sensory preferences. By the time I was a student there, Oren himself, a large, enthusiastically good-natured man from the Eastern Compact who had strong feelings about hospitality and very little patience for awkwardness, had basically created this unofficial multicultural space where different species could eat food that was appropriate for their biology without making a production of it. The lighting was adjustable. The sound levels were moderate. The tables were different heights to accommodate different body plans. It was the kind of place that happened because one person decided to make it happen, and it worked because that person was genuinely enthusiastic about it. Saren arrived about 10 minutes after the rest of us and stood in the doorway for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who is deciding whether this was a mistake. I waved. She came over. Oren appeared from somewhere with a menu already adapted for Sethani dietary requirements, because Oren always knew things like that, and Saren looked at the menu with something that might have been surprise. Our group that night was me, my labmate Priya, who was working on computational models of Cathari syntax, a biology PhD student called Dev, who was doing his dissertation on xenobiology of gas giant organisms, and a human Sethani studies student called Hannah, who was doing her 3rd year at Meridian as part of an exchange program from Vila's University. Hannah, as it turned out, was also Sethani. The moment Hannah and Saren made eye contact across the table was strange. I noticed it but didn't understand it. Hannah, who was usually one of the most relaxed and talkative people in our group, went very slightly still. And Saren, I caught something move through her expression, something very controlled, very quick. And then Hannah said something in Sethani, very quietly. And Saren responded, equally quietly, and Hannah's demeanor shifted entirely. She smiled at Saren and switched back to Standard. "I am honored," Hannah said in Standard. And Saren said, "Please, just Saren." I filed that away. I didn't ask about it. Over dinner, Saren was careful is the best word. She listened more than she talked. But when she did talk, she was precise and interesting, and she asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than politely performative. Dev spent about 20 minutes explaining his research on pressure organism symbiosis, and Saren asked exactly the right follow-up question at the end, the one that Dev had clearly been hoping someone would ask. Dev's face lit up the way faces do when someone understands the thing you've been trying to explain. "Yes," he said, "exactly, that's the entire yes." Saren glanced at me across the table, and I saw, clearly this time, something that was definitely amusement. After that she came every Thursday. It wasn't until about the 6th week that I started to notice things I couldn't explain. Small things at first, the kind of things you notice and then rationalize. Like the fact that every few days, usually in the evening, there would be a brief period where the bioluminescent tracery along Saren's temples would shift to a different pattern. Not dim, different. More structured, more complex. And her expression during those periods would change too in a way that was subtle but consistent. More deliberate, more weighted. I assumed it was a Sethani biological cycle thing. I didn't know enough about their physiology to say it wasn't. Like the fact that she knew things, not in a showing-off way, not in a way that called attention to itself, but in the way of someone who has access to information at a depth that doesn't quite make sense for a graduate student. She knew details about galactic compact political history that I couldn't find in any of our library's resources. Not wrong details, just deep details. Specifics. The kind of thing you'd know if you'd been in rooms where decisions were made. I asked her about it once. She said she'd done extensive research before starting the program. She said it in a way that was entirely plausible and entirely deflecting. Like the fact that Hannah, who had become a regular at our Thursday dinners, and was by that point a genuine friend to most of us, treated Saren with a specific kind of deference that she didn't extend to anyone else. It was subtle. Hannah was warm and casual with everyone, including Saren, in surface behavior. But there was an awareness in how she positioned herself, a particular attention when Saren spoke that was different from ordinary respect. I noticed it, I didn't know what to do with it. And like the fact that one evening, about 7 weeks in, I walked past the small garden courtyard on the north side of campus at around 11 at night and saw Saren standing there alone. Which wasn't unusual in itself. She walked in the evenings sometimes, she'd mentioned it. But she was standing very still, and she was looking up at the sky, and the bioluminescent tracery along her temples was burning. That's the only word I have for it. It was bright, complex, shifting, patterns I'd never seen on her before, rippling through the lines of luminescence like data moving through a circuit. And she was talking, quietly, in Sethani, which I didn't speak well enough to follow, but the cadence it wasn't the cadence of someone talking to themselves. It was the cadence of someone giving instructions, precise, measured, authoritative. She stopped when she heard my footsteps. The luminescence dimmed back to its usual quiet level almost instantaneously. She turned around, and there was a half-second where her face had an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Not alarm, exactly. More like the expression of someone who has been very careful for a long time and has just had to be more careful than usual. Then it smoothed out. "Marcus," she said, "you are walking late." "Library was open until midnight," I said. "You okay?" "I was observing the stars," she said. "I find it useful when I am," a pause, "when I need to think." I looked up. The sky was overcast. You couldn't see any stars. "I didn't say that." "Yeah," I said, "I get that." We walked back toward the main building together, and she talked about her coursework, and I talked about my thesis, and it was perfectly normal. But I kept thinking about the expression I'd caught in that half-second, and the cadence of whatever she'd been saying. I didn't say anything to anyone. It wasn't my business. She wasn't doing anything wrong. People have private lives. People have things they don't tell near strangers they've known for 7 weeks. But I started paying attention differently after that. Not suspiciously. More carefully. The way you pay attention when you care about someone and you're starting to sense that they're carrying something heavy. The crisis, when it came, arrived in the middle of a Thursday dinner. It was week 11. The end of the semester was approaching, and everyone was in that particular state of exhausted determination that characterizes the final stretch of any academic term. Priya was 3 days from submitting a paper and running on about 4 hours of sleep. Dev had his advisor review the following morning. Even Hannah, who was generally unflappable, had the slightly hollow look of someone who had recently had an existential confrontation with their dissertation timeline. Saren was different. I noticed it when she arrived. The luminescent tracery was not just dim. It was almost absent in a way I'd never seen before. And she sat down and ordered something and participated in the conversation with the same precision she always brought, but something in the texture of her presence was different. Something underneath the surface. About 40 minutes in, her tablet, the non-human one, lit up. She glanced at it, and every light in her face went out. Not figuratively. The bioluminescent tracery went completely dark. I had never seen that happen in a Sethani before, and I didn't know, then, what it meant, but my stomach dropped the way it does when you see something, and your body understands it before your brain does. She excused herself quietly, very quietly. She went out to the back hallway near the kitchen, which had a door to the small service courtyard. Hannah watched her go, and then Hannah's expression, which had been tired and friendly, became something else entirely. "I need to step outside," Hannah said. She said it normally, pleasantly, and she excused herself and followed Saren. I waited about 2 minutes, then I followed both of them. I don't know what I thought I was going to do. I think I just couldn't sit there. Something about the way Saren's bioluminescence had gone dark made the back of my neck prickle in a way I couldn't ignore. The service courtyard was a small concrete square with a recycling terminal and a fire door and not much else. It was cold. Saren was standing against the far wall, and Hannah was standing about 3 feet in front of her, and Hannah was not using her inside voice. She was speaking Sethani, rapidly, quietly, but intensely, and I understood about 1 word in 5, which was enough to get the emotional register, if not the content. Hannah was not arguing, more like she was presenting a case. Urgent. The cadence you use when you are trying to convince someone of something they are resistant to. Saren was not responding in the same register. She was quiet, very still. The expression on her face was the one I'd started to catalog by then as her processing face. The one that meant she was weighing something and not liking the options available to her. They both noticed me at the same time. Hannah straightened. Saren looked at me, and in the low light of the courtyard I could see that the bioluminescent tracery had come back slightly, faint, unsteady, the way a signal comes back through interference. I said the most inadequate thing I have ever said in my life. "Is everything okay?" Saren looked at me for a long moment. I couldn't read her expression. Then she looked at Hannah, and something passed between them, A quick, silent exchange of the kind that requires context I didn't have. Hannah turned to face me directly. And in Standard, she said, there has been an incident in the outer reach systems. Political. It requires a response. A response from, I started. From me, Saren said. She said it quietly. She said it the way someone says something they've been not saying for a long time. I looked at her, the dim, unsteady luminescence, the weight in her eyes that had been there from the first day, the way Hannah had said, I am honored at that first dinner, the cadence I'd heard in the courtyard 11 weeks ago. Something was assembling itself in my head, pieces that had been in the wrong order rearranging themselves. What kind of response? I said carefully. Saren was quiet for another moment. Then she said, there are 3 Sethani planetary systems in the outer reach cluster. For the last 4 standard months, there has been political pressure from a faction within the Galactic Compact Administration to reclassify those systems under direct compact jurisdiction. This would effectively end the system's self-governance agreements. Another pause. 2 days ago, the faction moved a formal proposal through the Secondary Administrative Council. It is expected to reach the Primary Compact Council in 9 days. I said, and you need to respond to that. The response requires authorization, she said, at a level I cannot provide from here without revealing why I am here. Something clicked. Why you're here, I repeated slowly, as a student. The luminescent tracery shifted, a very brief, complex pattern. Yes. Saren, I said. Who are you? She held my gaze for what felt like a very long time. Then she straightened, and it was a small change, a shift in posture, but it was like watching someone take off a coat they'd been wearing for months. Her chin lifted. Her shoulders settled differently. The luminescent tracery along her temples brightened slowly to something that was nothing like the dim quiet I'd associated with her, and everything like something being switched on. My full designation, she said, is Saren Velineth Anseth, 7th Sovereign of the Sethani Imperial Convergence, Supreme Commander of the 3rd and 7th Fleets, and Keeper of the Aenith Concordat. The fire door on my left clicked in the cold wind. And you've been, I said, at Meridian taking classes. In the graduate program in political economy. Understanding human economic historiography, she said, is directly relevant to negotiating with the Compact Council, which operates through human-derived legal and economic frameworks. I determined that understanding those frameworks from the inside, rather than through briefings, would make me a more effective advocate for my people. I looked at Hannah. I am her attaché, Hannah said, and her guard, and I have been saying for 3 weeks that she needs to communicate with her advisors about the outer reach situation, but she... I am aware of what you have been saying, Saren said, with the quiet precision of someone who has had this conversation before. I leaned against the cold concrete wall. I needed the support. Okay, I said. Okay, so there are 3 planets of your people in danger of losing their self-governance, and you need to respond to a Compact Council proposal, and you can't do that without revealing that you're here. I thought for a moment. Why can't you just? Because my being here is a political vulnerability, she said. There are factions within both the Compact and the Sethani Convergence who would use my presence at a human university, alone, without full Imperial protocol, as evidence of weakness, of poor judgment. If it becomes known that the Supreme Commander of the Sethani 3rd and 7th Fleets spent 3 months in a human graduate program without her council's knowledge. Did your council not know? A pause. They believed I was on a diplomatic retreat. A diplomatic retreat, I repeated. To a remote facility, for contemplation and strategic review. Not to Meridian Institute of Advanced Studies. No, not to Meridian. I looked up at the overcast sky. No stars. Exactly as starless as they'd been 11 weeks ago when she'd stood in the north courtyard and told me she was observing them. Okay, I said for the 3rd time. Okay, what can I do? They both looked at me. I'm sorry. I'm asking what I can do. You're my friend, you have a problem. I'm asking what I can do. The bioluminescent tracery along Saren's temples shifted again. That complex pattern, but this time slower, steadier. And something in her expression changed, broke slightly, in a way that I think she hadn't intended to let happen. Marcus, she said, this is not. I know it's not my business. You're the seventh sovereign of the whatever, the convergence, and I'm a graduate student in xenolinguistics, and I couldn't even correctly identify a dialect variant in my thesis chapter. I know the scale here. I stopped, started again. I'm just asking, because it's what you do. When someone you care about has a problem, you ask what you can do. Hannah made a sound that might have been a Sethani equivalent of well. She looked at Sarin. Sarin looked at me for a long moment. There is, she said quietly, one thing that might help. The thing that might help turned out to be this. The Compact Council's proposal was framed around economic viability metrics that the outer reach systems allegedly failed to meet. The argument was that without direct compact administrative oversight, those systems could not maintain economic stability within compact standards. It was the kind of proposal that sounded bureaucratically reasonable and was actually a land grab dressed up in economic language, which is, honestly, one of the oldest political moves in any civilization, human or otherwise. The counterargument required demonstrating that the economic viability metrics used in the proposal were themselves flawed, that they'd been constructed using a measurement framework that had been challenged in the academic literature for about 6 years, including very directly by 2 papers published in journals that the Compact Council was technically obligated to recognize as authoritative. Sarin knew this. Her advisors knew this. But translating the academic counterargument into the specific legal economic language of a Compact Council submission was a problem, because the submission formats were derived from human legal and economic traditions, and while Sarin's standard was excellent, the very precise lexical and structural conventions of a formal Compact Council countersubmission were something she didn't have. But I did, because my thesis supervisor, Professor Holloway, had spent 15 years as a consultant for the Compact Council's Translation and Interpretation Office before she came to Meridian. And in the second year of my program, she had made all of her graduate students work through a complete module on the Council's formal submission framework as a practical exercise in applied xenolinguistics. I had hated it at the time. I had complained extensively. Priya and I had spent an entire evening in the student lounge making fun of the Council's style guide, which had 42 subsections dedicated to the appropriate use of the subjunctive mood in administrative framing language. I knew that style guide. I had memorized it under protest. You need a submission, I said. In council format. I need the economic counterargument framed in terms the council cannot dismiss on procedural grounds, Sarin said, which means it must follow the formal submission conventions precisely. I can do that. Marcus. I can do that, I said again. I've done it. I know it's not a thesis exercise, I know the stakes are different, but the format is the format. Walk me through the economic argument, explain it to me, and I'll structure it. She looked at me with that look I'd seen in her eyes since the very first day. The weight of it. And underneath, now that I knew what I was looking at, something else, something complicated and old that I didn't have a name for yet. Why, she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking, like she needed to understand. Because it's the right thing to do, I said. Because 3 planets of people shouldn't lose their self-governance because of a rigged viability metric. And because you've been sitting in this gray, damp city for 3 months, alone, without anyone who knows who you actually are, trying to understand us well enough to protect your people. The least I can do is help you write a document. Hannah made the sound again, louder this time. Sarin was quiet for a long moment. The luminescence along her temples was steady now, warm. All right, she said. We worked through the night. All 3 of us, Sarin, Hannah, and me, in the empty seminar room on the 3rd floor of the xenolinguistics building, which I had a keycard for because I needed after-hours access for translation interface sessions. The recycling logistics office next door was dark. The compressed aluminum smell was, as always, present. Sarin laid out the economic argument. She was, I'm going to say this directly, brilliant. Not in a generic way, not in the way people say brilliant to mean smarter than average. The way she could hold a multi-dimensional argument in her head, track every thread of it, anticipate the counter-arguments at each node, and preemptively address them. It was like watching someone play chess 15 moves ahead. She explained the viability metric framework and its flaws with the same precision she'd brought to picking apart the terrible economics textbook, but the depth behind it was different. This wasn't academic analysis. This was someone who had spent years living with the consequences of the system she was describing. Hannah provided legal precedent. There were 3 prior compact council cases that created relevant precedent, and Hannah had them memorized with a level of detail that suggested she'd been preparing for exactly this situation for some time. And I translated. That's the most accurate way to put it. I translated the argument into the formal submission language. I matched the lexical register to the council's style guide. I structured the argument sections according to the procedural conventions that made a submission undismissible on technical grounds. I wrote the subjunctive framings in the 42 subsections worth of ways that the guide specified for administrative challenge language. Around 2 in the morning, Priya texted to find out where I was. I sent back a message that said I was working on something and I'd explain later. She responded with a thumbs-up emoji and the words, "Thesis emergency." I said yes, because it was the closest available description. Around 4 in the morning, Sarin read through the completed draft. She read it twice. Then she set it down and was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than most moments do. "This is," she said, "exactly what we needed." "I might have over-indexed on the subjunctive framings in Section 7, I said. "I wasn't sure whether to use the formal or modified formal register for the precedent citations." "The formal register is correct," she paused. "I would not have known to make that distinction." "That's why you're in the political economy program and not the xenolinguistics program." Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, further in that direction than I'd seen before. Hannah was already preparing the secure transmission. The submission needed to go through official Sethani convergence diplomatic channels. Hannah had the codes, and it needed to arrive at the compact council's receiving office before the formal review window closed. There were 6 hours. While Hannah worked, Sarin and I sat in the quiet seminar room, and I made us both terrible vending machine coffee from the machine down the hall, because I'd forgotten the coffee machine in the student lounge was not accessible at 4 in the morning. She held the cup with both hands, same as the first time, wanting the warmth. "How much longer were you planning to be here?" I asked, "before any of this?" "The semester ends in 3 weeks, she said. "I intended to complete my coursework. My advisors believe I return in 4 weeks." "What were you going to do about your thesis?" "I am not completing a thesis. I am auditing the full program, not seeking a degree." "Does Meridian know that?" "There is a provision for external enrollment under compact academic exchange agreements. The paperwork was handled through channels that," a pause, "appropriately obscured the nature of my enrollment." "So you're not actually in the political economy graduate program?" "I am attending all the classes and completing all the coursework." "But not officially enrolled." "The distinction," she said, with the precision that I'd come to recognize as her version of dry humor, "is largely administrative." I laughed. I laughed for real, the tired, slightly unhinged laugh of 4:30 in the morning with no sleep and a very strange night. And after a moment Sarin made a sound that I had not heard from her before. It was quiet and brief, and it was, unmistakably, her version of laughter, which was a thing I hadn't known she could do, because in 11 weeks of Thursday dinners and library conversations and seminar room discussions, I had never quite gotten her there. "The terrible economics textbook," I said. "The 3rd chapter is a particular offense against rigorous scholarship. You should write a rebuttal paper. I am the 7th sovereign of the Sethani Imperial Convergence." "So, you have thoughts?" She looked at me with the weight in her eyes and the warmth of the coffee cup in her hands, and she said, "Yes, I have thoughts." The submission went through at 5:47 in the morning. Hannah sent the confirmation with the particular controlled relief of someone who has been worried about something for a long time and is now only slightly less worried. Sarin acknowledged it. Then she sat for a moment and I watched the bioluminescent tracery along her temples shift through a long, slow pattern complex at first, then gradually settling, like static resolving into a clear signal. "What happens now?" I asked. "The submission will be reviewed. The review process takes between 5 and 14 standard days. During that time, the Compact Council's Economic Committee will examine the counterargument and the precedent citations." She paused. "There will be political pressure from the faction that proposed the reclassification, but the argument is sound. and the submission is technically correct. And if they deny it anyway, then I will have to stop being a student, she said it simply, without drama, and there will be a formal diplomatic response at a level that cannot be conducted quietly. But you think the submission will work? I think, she said, that it gives my people the best available chance within this framework, and that was what I came here to learn. I sat with that for a moment, the empty seminar room, the pre-dawn quiet, the compressed aluminum smell. Sarin, I said, can I ask you something that might be rude? You may ask. Why didn't you trust anyone here for 11 weeks? Why did you carry this alone? She was quiet for longer than usual. The luminescence traced a slow, private pattern. I have, she said finally, spent many years learning that people who know what I am treat me in accordance with what I am, not in accordance with who I am. The distinction becomes, she paused, wearing over a long period of time. I thought about that, so you came somewhere no one knew. I came somewhere I could think and learn and be, another pause, present in a way that my position does not otherwise permit. And then I sat down. And then you sat down, she agreed. Did that mess up your plan? A very long pause. Then I had not anticipated it. Was it a problem? She looked at me with the weight and the warmth in her eyes. The luminescent tracery was steady, warm-toned if that description makes any sense. No, she said, it was not a problem. The Compact Council's Economic Committee reviewed the submission. It took 11 days. The ruling came through on a Tuesday, which I know because I was in the translation interface room when Hannah came to find me. She didn't say anything when she came in. She just stood in the doorway and her expression was Sethani facial expressions and human ones don't map perfectly. I've said that, but there are some things that are universal. Relief is universal. The particular kind of relief that comes when something you've been braced for a long time doesn't happen. The proposal was rejected, she said, on procedural grounds. The committee found that the viability metrics used in the proposal were not consistent with the current compact academic consensus. They cited 3 papers, including 2 from the Galactic Economic Review that were in the counter-submission. I sat back in my chair. 11 days of checking my messages. 11 days of trying to focus on my restructured thesis chapter and mostly failing. 11 days of Thursday dinners that were almost entirely normal. Sarin came to both of them, was precise and dry and interested in everyone's research the way she always was, and yet completely different now that I knew what was underneath. The outer reach systems, I said, they're safe. The specific proposal is rejected. The faction will likely try again through other channels, but this gives us time. She paused. And it demonstrates to the Compact Council that the Convergence will contest procedurally invalid challenges with procedurally correct responses, which is, in its own way, a message. I nodded. Where's Sarin? She is in the North Garden, Hannah said. She has been there for approximately an hour. I knew the North Garden. I'd seen her there before, standing in the dark, looking up at a sky where you couldn't see the stars. I went there now. She was standing in the same place as that night 11 weeks ago. The overcast was different today, thinner, moving, and through it you could see a few stars. The ones that were always there overhead, regardless of whether the sky was cooperative enough to show them. I came and stood next to her and didn't say anything for a minute. The bioluminescent tracery along her temples was bright, not with the structured intensity I'd seen the night she was giving instructions. Something different. More like the pattern she'd had in the early morning hours of the submission night after the relief settled in. Hannah told me, I said. Yes, a long pause. The outer reach systems will remain self-governing. Good. The procedural challenge will create precedent. Other systems that face similar proposals will have a framework for response. Another pause. I had not fully anticipated that secondary effect. It may be more significant than the primary ruling. Your students would be proud, I said, political economy thinking. The terrible textbook, she said, was not entirely without value. We stood there in the thin cloud dark, with the stars visible in the gaps overhead. 3 weeks, I said, until the semester ends. Yes. And then you go back. Yes, she didn't say anything for a moment. I will complete my coursework first. The final assignment for the historiography seminar is a case analysis. I intend to submit it. Professor Keel grades hard. I am aware. Her feedback on my midterm submission was extensive. What did she say? That my analysis was technically precise, but demonstrated insufficient engagement with the human experiential dimension of post-boundary economic disruption. A pause. She said, and I am quoting, "You need to think about what it felt like, not just what it meant." I thought about that. She's right, actually. I know, a slight shift in the luminescence. It is not a skill that has been frequently required of me. What does it feel like, I asked, being here for the last 3 months? A long silence, the kind that has things in it. It has felt, she said carefully, like remembering something I had not known I forgot. I didn't ask her to explain that. I didn't need to. We stood there for a while longer, looking at the stars through the gaps in the cloud. After a few minutes, she said, very quietly, "Marcus." "Yeah. Thank you for," she started again, "for sitting down." I smiled up at the stars. "Any time," I said. The last Thursday dinner was different. Not sad, I want to be clear about that. Saren didn't do sad the way humans do, and being around her had given me a different relationship to endings. She treated departure the way she treated most things, as a state that had its own logic, its own appropriate response. But it was different. Dev brought some kind of cake from the bakery 2 streets over, which was a gesture so entirely Dev that it made Priya and I both laugh when he produced it. Hannah was there, and I'd never seen Hannah fully relaxed before, not in the way she was that evening. Something had been released for her too. Saren sat at the table where she'd sat every Thursday for 11 weeks, and she was present in a way that felt complete, not performed. She was just there, in the room with us, with the warm light and the bad wine and Dev's bakery cake and the usual accumulated disaster of our respective academic situations. At some point, she talked about the final assignment for Professor Keel's seminar. She'd revised it, she said, with a focus on the experiential dimension. She'd consulted several sources. "What sources?" Priya asked. "Human sources," Saren said. "People, conversations." A pause. "It is, I found, a different kind of research from what I usually do, but valuable." "Did Professor Keel like it better?" "She has not yet returned it, but she said when I submitted that she was," another pause, "that she was glad I'd enrolled. She said the quality of my engagement with the material had been a genuine contribution to the seminar." There was a kind of quiet at the table that was comfortable, the kind that means everyone is feeling something they don't need to say out loud. Oren came by at the end of the evening and said something to Saren in a mix of standard, and what sounded like a few words of Sethani that he'd clearly picked up somewhere. She answered him with the expression that was her version of a smile. He beamed and went back to his kitchen. Walking out afterward, Saren and I fell behind the group by a few paces, the way you do when you're not quite ready for something to be over. "The counter-submission," she said. "I want you to know that it will be referenced in the official record of the Outer Reach case, as the work of a Meridian Institute xenolinguistics scholar." "You didn't need to do that." "The credit belongs where it is due," she glanced at me. "The official record will not specify the scholar's name. The circumstances are complex." "That's fine," I said. "I'm not looking for credit." "I know," she said. "And then, that is one of several things about you that I did not anticipate." I thought about asking what the others were. I decided not to. She left on a Tuesday morning. I know because Hannah told me, which was the most I was going to get, because Saren leaving, actually leaving, was not something that could look like a student completing a semester. There were things that had to happen at a level I wasn't privy to, and that was fine. That made sense. I was in the xenolinguistics building, working on my restructured thesis chapter 3, which, after several weeks of effort and one very useful conversation with Saren about the nature of regional dialect variation in politically stratified speech communities, was actually coming together. The foundation that had been tested was more reliable than one that hadn't. Turns out she was right about that. My tablet lit up, not my normal messaging system. A different channel, one I didn't recognize, with a routing code that, when I looked it up later, turned out to be a Sethani diplomatic communications node. One message. No name, no formal designation, just, "The stars, Marcus, are always there, even when the sky does not cooperate. Thank you for the coffee. Thank you for sitting down. Thank you for understanding without being told that knowing what someone is and knowing who they are not the same thing. The outer reach systems are safe. The academic record at Meridian Institute has been one of the more unusual experiences of my reign. I recommend it. The third chapter of Green's textbook remains an offense against rigorous scholarship. Yes, I read it 3 times. Then I put my tablet face down on my desk and looked at the wall for a minute. Then I turned back to my thesis. The Compact Council's ruling on the outer reach systems became a significant precedent case. I know that now because it became public record within about a year, when a similar challenge came up for a different cluster of self-governing systems, and the legal teams cited it immediately. The ruling has been referenced in 8 subsequent Compact Council cases, according to the public record. The counter-submission that initiated the ruling is in the official case file, listed as the work of a Meridian Institute xenolinguistics scholar, name unspecified per diplomatic confidentiality conventions. I finished my thesis 8 months later. Professor Holloway called it the most sophisticated treatment of Cathari phonological analysis she'd seen from a master's student in 12 years. I think about what Sarin said about the restructured foundation being more reliable. I think about it more often than seems entirely proportionate for a piece of academic advice. I've been asked over the years what she was like, by people who have heard versions of the story or fragments of it, or by journalists who have pieced together parts of it from public records. I never know how to answer in a way that doesn't flatten her into either a symbol or a curiosity. She was precise. She was dry. She was the only person I have ever met who could make me feel like my long-winded explanations of linguistic theory were genuinely interesting rather than politely tolerated. She asked exactly the right follow-up question every time. She held a cup of bad coffee with both hands because she wanted the warmth. She was a head of state who spent 3 months at an underfunded Northern Compact university, doing her coursework, sitting in bad ergonomic chairs, eating at Oren's on Thursdays, looking at stars through overcast skies. She was trying to understand us, so she could protect her people. That's what I tell people when they ask. She was trying to understand us. And she sat at a table in the student lounge and looked like she was having the same kind of bad day I was having, which she was, just at a scale I hadn't quite grasped yet. And I sat down. I got one more message about 2 years later, same routing code. It said, "The secondary reading list for post-boundary economic historiography has been updated. There is a new paper in the Galactic Economic Review that addresses the viability metric framework properly. Finally. I thought you would want to know." Yes, I sent back about time. The third chapter of Green is still wrong, though. The response came 4 minutes later, which, given that she was the supreme commander of the Sethani 3rd and 7th Fleets, implied a level of promptness that I chose to find flattering. Yes, it is.